Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Bowl Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samby. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. So, Peter, it's not often that we cite Rolling Stone magazine here. In fact, we never do. But Rolling Stone ran an interesting article the other day. The thrust of it was that Trump is a very dangerous person because Trump will take the United States out of NATO. And so whoa, that sounds like good news. And so I thought, well, this might be an interesting
words of wisdom.
Exactly. Let's so we should take a look and see is this soundly based. So I want to just show you this this article and what they've based this conclusion on, because it is important to remember that Trump has always been against NATO. I mean, even back in 2000, he was planning to run in 2000. He published a book just before that, a kind of a campaign book, in which he urged American withdrawal from NATO. And his line has always been, "Hey, this is we're giving others a free ride. Uncle Sam is being, robbed blind. It doesn't make any sense to defend countries that are wealthy, and doing very nicely. Why exactly we are committing to them when they have a much nicer lifestyle than we have? Nice.
So the U.S. pays for their defense and freeing up resources in Europe to pay for their social welfare programs.
Exactly.
Which Americans don't have.
Exactly. They have a very comfortable welfare state, and they also basically have enjoyable lives. They have, these like the 6-week vacation. I mean, who in America has a 6-week vacation? Who in America takes the whole month of August off? Plenty of Europeans take the month of August off. So it was a reasonable point, and others have made that point, of course, themselves. But not any of them actually got to be president. No, I'm sorry, this is not the one. Let me try again. That was not the one. That's the one. This is live television. This is so anyway. Trump plots to pull out of NATO if he doesn't get his way, and it says, at the very least, the former president wants to put U.S. on standby mode and undermine NATO's principle of collective defense. And again, remember, even when he was first elected president and he did an interview with Tucker Carlson, he was expressing some skepticism as to why we should go to the defense of Montenegro. It was particularly Montenegro, because I think he said, well, they're very aggressive people and they might get us involved in a war.
Okay, well, look at the subtitle there. See, this is again trying to frame a narrative that is not necessarily true. At the very least, the former president wants to put the U.S. on standby mode and undermine NATO's principle of collective defense. Well, the United States can leave NATO, NATO can continue to exist, and they can continue to have collective defense.
That's right.
So see how suggestive this is? Right.
Exactly. As if they can't do collective defense without the United States.
Why not?
Exactly. So Donald Trump wanted to pull the United States out of NATO during his first term, but was repeatedly talked out of it by senior administration officials. For a possible second term in the White House, the 2024 Republican presidential frontrunner is already discussing how he could actually get it done if his demands aren't met by NATO. He and his policy wonk allies are also gaming out how he could dramatically wind down American involvement to merely a standby position in NATO, in Trump's own words. So again, notice how there's this panic mode at this whole idea, because after all, through most of human history, you kind of have to, look out for yourself. I mean, you're not part of some gigantic alliance, and somebody else is now committed to going to war on your behalf. I mean, that's not the way states organize themselves.
Countries don't have friends; they have interests.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yes.
George, Donald Trump wanted to pull the United States out of NATO. I mean, while he was president, there was no initiative whatsoever. He criticized it, but I think you and I would have come across it. Okay,
I think so. He criticized it. That's the thing. He would criticize. And you remember when he went to one of those NATO meetings and he was berating. I think it was berating Stoltenberg.
Yes,
Stoltenberg's forever, and he was saying, why, Germany has signed this deal, this Nord Stream deal. They're getting their natural gas from Russia, and we're supposed to be defending Germany from Russia. I don't understand. What's the
and Pompeo was
yeah, that's it. Pompeo was, they were looking unhappy. And that woman, that Kay Bailey Hutchison, she was the U.S.
That's who I was trying to
yeah, Kay Bailey Hutchison, a total non-entity. She was a one-term senator from Texas, but she got this gig. She's the U.S. ambassador to NATO, and she was just looking, stony faced in front of her. Hey, we're not supposed to talk like that.
I think those two characters actually met eyes because they were,
maybe they met eyes. What's going on? When the former president has privately discussed the United States' role in the transatlantic military alliance this year, Trump has made clear that he doesn't want the upper ranks of a second administration to be staffed by NATO lovers. Well, who does? I mean, the ex-president has made these kinds of jabs at the long-standing alliance during conversations related to the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine. Trump, the sources say, has continued to express an openness to pulling the US out of NATO altogether. However, Trump has suggested that this could be averted if the alliance, which Trump once famously called obsolete, gives in to his newest demands. This would include his desires for non-American members to further and steeply increase their defense spending, and for a re-evaluation of the bedrock principle that an attack on one member is tantamount to an attack on all. Now, the issue of getting others to cough up money it's always seemed like the logic of it was impeccable. I mean, if you're so afraid of Russia or whoever it is that you're supposed to be afraid of, how come you're not spending any money? I mean, why is it, you just sort of sit there, do nothing, and then tell us how terrified you are of Russia, and then you expect us to, launch nuclear war on your behalf? I mean, it just doesn't, it doesn't seem like a good arrangement.
Well, given the fact, George, that NATO has failed to keep the peace.
Yes, that's exactly.
Do we need any other evidence?
That's exactly right.
Folks?
That's exactly right.
Do we need any other evidence? We don't have any more evidence.
Exactly right. When he was in office, Trump would repeatedly scoff at this collective defense clause of the North Atlantic Treaty, known as Article 5. One former senior administration official recalls to Rolling Stone a moment in the Oval Office in mid-2018 when the then president started reading from a written list of smaller NATO countries, some of which he argued most Americans had never even heard of before.
True.
I'm sure, you tell Americans, we're committed to going to war for Estonia. Where's that? And North Macedonia. And then Trump then vented that, quote, starting World War III, unquote, over some of these countries' sovereignty made absolutely no sense, and that he shouldn't be forced to automatically commit American troops to any such crisis. Well, again, the logic is impeccable. I mean, they started this organization in 1949 when nobody had anything. Europe lay prostrate, and the Red Army was triumphant. And so they said, okay, well, if the Red Army attacks, we'll be there for you. But where's the logic? I mean, where's the Red Army? Europe is extremely prosperous. They can afford a very handsome, ample military.
Well, I'm not really sure, and I'm not really sure Rolling Stone is sure, but Trump intuitively, it seems to me, to understand what Article 5 is all about, instead of the mythology that Article 5, Article 5, invoke Article 5. Okay. Article 5 is very different than what most people think it is. And I think Trump, I don't know if he's read Article 5, but he seems to intuitively understand it's not what everyone says it is.
Right, right. But also, I mean, I think he feels that, well, you know, the whole point of NATO is essentially to get America involved in a war. And so he's president of the United States, and he's saying, well, that means we're on the hook. You know, with all these countries that aren't doing anything themselves, they basically are in a position of get us involved in a war. I mean, you know, and again, any president of the United States should start. I'm worried about that. I'm worried that we might get sucked into a war that we
All
have
he
no
wanted
interest
to
in.
do was build a wall.
And then he says, it would be tremendous. And then they quote somebody called Dr. Aaron Stein, a Black Sea Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I like this, you know, what does a Black Sea Fellow do? He hangs out on the Black Sea, you know, just enjoying himself, you know, in the Black Sea.
I don't think the Russian Navy is too welcoming to Black Sea Fellows. Okay.
But anyway, so it was a tremendously stupid endeavor, especially at a time when war in Europe rages and much of Europe is looking to the United States to deter further conflict. Trading away allies based on ignorance, and Trump is ignorant about this issue, is just silly for broader US national security. So presumably what isn't silly is to start risking nuclear war. That isn't silly. That's the height of intelligence, you know, but
okay, well, you know, Dr. Aaron Stein. I hate when people want to be referred to by doctor.
That's right,
okay?
exactly.
It's really pompous. Okay.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Aaron Stein, I have a better idea for you. The security architecture in Europe after the end of the Cold War failed to keep the peace. So why don't you, Dr. Aaron Stein, a Black Sea Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, start thinking about new architecture?
That's right.
Instead of creating an architecture without Russia and against Russia, why don't you rethink the entire process?
That's right. Exactly. That's right. But no, they have to stick to this. I think
arcane.
1949. They set it up in 1949. So we've got 75 years, and they still want to stick with it. And then it says, but this time around, an array of nationalist allies and pro-Trump policy wonks have been eager to offer the ex-president frameworks for how to magify the US approach to NATO. One possibility that has piqued Trump's interest in recent months is what the former president has privately branded as NATO on standby, according to sources familiar with his private musings. Trump's idea reflects some of the arguments laid out.
Trump doesn't muse. I don't think
he doesn't really muse.
Not a muse.
No. But I can imagine he'd be grumbling about NATO.
Grumbling? Yes.
Yes.
But he doesn't muse.
He doesn't muse. Yes, he's not a muser. Trump's idea reflects some of the arguments laid out in a policy brief published in February by researcher and conservative writer Dr. Sumantra Mitra. I've never heard of him, so. Titled Pivoting the US Away from Europe to a Dormant NATO. The paper was posted by the Center for Renewing America, a think tank stacked with Trump administration veterans and MAGA Republicans that is laying the groundwork to be a premier policy driver if Trump retakes the presidency. So naturally, I went to this paper, see what this guy says, and this is it, pivoting the US away from Europe to a dormant NATO. And it says, the paper highlights the history of the debate about NATO commitments, outlines Washington's current strategy of forward presence, and argues why that is flawed under the changed circumstances. The paper concludes with an alternative policy of a dormant NATO, wherein Europe is the primary security provider of the European front and flanks. At the same time, the US is an offshore balancer focused loosely on global maritime and trade security and the Asia-Pacific theater.
Keep going, George. It sounds good to me.
Sounds good, yes. The end of the Cold War, the diminishing of Russian strategic threat resulted in the significant reduction of American forces in Europe, but did not decrease European dependence on the US. Subsequent American grand strategy ensured that Europe remained incentivized to avoid carrying the burden of their own defense. Well, that's true, incentivized. If threat is will plus capability, then there is no evidence thus far to indicate that Russia either has the will or capability to launch an expansionist push into the rest of NATO, given
Europe,
their
rest of
oh
Europe.
yeah, the rest of Europe, yes, given their performance so far in eastern Ukraine, while the invasion violates a feeble norm against state versus state war over territory, it's not clear why a peripheral war in the far eastern reaches of Europe would affect core American strategic interests. NATO claims it faces persistent threats of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, pervasive instability, rising strategic competition, and advancing authoritarianism challenge the alliance. The authoritarianism challenge the alliance's interests and values. This is when they put on the shopping list, the NATO shopping list, like, well, what are your tasks? Well, we're doing, instability, climate change, human rights, just keep, listing all these things, all the things that NATO is supposed to be doing, which means, of course, that NATO isn't doing any of those things. However, NATO was not meant to deter non-state actors, and most European terrorism comes either from elements already living within the European Union or from unchecked migration from Africa, issues which NATO is both structurally ill-qualified and legally unsuitable for countering. Furthermore, NATO's assertion that advancing authoritarianism is a threat to alliance raises some major questions. Who gets to define what authoritarianism is? Well, that is definitely a major question. In an era where any deviation from politically liberal internationalism is considered authoritarian by some, is the alliance now interested in policing within its borders against its own citizens for the threat of authoritarianism? And if so, what measures is it willing to take to tackle this vaguely defined threat?
Well, Germany may be the test case.
Yeah, but because he does. I mean, he clearly, Viktor Orban, they say, well, he's an authoritarian. He wins elections. There's political parties here who oppose Orban, but they don't have any popularity, so they've declared Orban as an authoritarian. Doubtless the new prime minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, will also soon be in the authoritarian group.
Well, this is prescient. I think this is very interesting, is that would NATO as a organization headed by the United States be used against a NATO country? Interesting.
I think so. Yeah, I wouldn't put it past NATO.
Me, that's why I think it's interesting.
Yes. There he goes on. In short, the many concerns listed have no clear tie to NATO's mission of deterrence and defense. Instead, NATO is an alliance in need of an adversary, and like every bureaucratic organization, it is preoccupied with its own growth and sustenance. That's, impeccable analysis. I mean, we've talked about this many, many times. We added a little bit of levity about they love these dinners and the excellent meals and first-rate wines that they get at these meetings. But basically, yeah, they just want to keep growing and growing and building their bureaucracy and having very fancy buildings, to show how important they are. The US has struggled to coerce European allies into spending more of for their own defense, and every effort to give an ultimatum or timeline for burden shifting to Europe has been thwarted by lobbying from either the Europeans or American transatlanticists. Yeah, all the burden shifting, it never has gone anywhere. It is also imprudent to expect that NATO would take any adequate burden regarding China. The European public is averse to a conflict with China. Then he goes, NATO expansion was an ideological decision during the peak post-Cold War unipolarity and was bound to be unsustainable in the long run. Like most bureaucracies, the supranational organization grew to survive. It morphed from a military alliance to an ideological and political group, simultaneously finding new tasks to sustain its existence while undermining the nationalist or independent strategic thinking of its member states. And finally, the expansion of NATO has stymied European burden sharings in two main ways. It resulted in perpetual free riding for the Western powers who saw no threat on their own horizon. Yeah. It also resulted in a number of Eastern protectorates unsustainably dependent on foreign great powers for survival. Yet there are often ideologically liberal internationalists, extremely sanctimonious and partial to taking sides in the domestic debates of their foreign great power benefactors, which is, we've seen that, like we had Rasmussen, who continually comes to Washington and to berate the Republicans for insufficient zeal in supporting Ukraine. This is I think it's a pretty sound analysis. I mean, it's
Glad you're presenting it to us, George, because I would we should have some modesty here, but I think George and I have said every single one of these points at one point in time. We've come across someone that's distilled it down in a very compelling way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then burden sharing is a collaborative process that risks derailment by the entrenched regional protectorates in Europe and the NATO bureaucracy. Burden shifting is a unilateral exercise of power driven by American interests. It provides a rapid and firm timeline, forcing Europe to plan resources and alternatives. Europe faces no comparable threat to the one it faced during the Cold War, and Europe's combined capabilities far outweigh Russia's. It is in the European interest to defend finite European frontiers, and therefore, obviously, Ukraine isn't part of that. And then the US should start orienting a fixed timeline of burden shifting within NATO and undertake a more detached offshore balancing approach. An offshore balancer strategy entails the US serving as a logistics provider of last resort and Washington as the final guarantor of free sea lanes and trade routes. It would mean a limited American naval and air presence in Europe to support these missions. Additionally, since Britain and France are historical allies with independent nuclear deterrence, it is in America's interest to maintain closer security relations with these nations than the rest of Europe.
Oh, Poland won't like that.
No, Poland wouldn't like that. But there it is. A dormant NATO would mean that all other structures and local defense costs would burden the Europeans. And then the NATO bureaucracy is a barrier in the path of reduced American commitment. Yeah, they're gonna fight like hell, as well as all of their vast public relations machine, which NATO is very good at. It makes a lot of noise, and it has all of its allies in Washington who are always panicking about MAGA. MAGA is going to undermine NATO. It is a self-sustaining and prone to push missions that are beyond NATO's core role, and at times opposed to the domestic interests of the United States. Radically reducing the NATO bureaucracy should be a chief aim. Stoltenberg won't like that. A dormant NATO would mean a complete moratorium on activities that do not fall within a strictly military remit and only maintain organizational structures that would be needed and activated in the case of a major war. NATO should also stop all expansion. A bloc that is constantly mutating and expanding cannot have a coherent grand strategy. Nope, that has never had a coherent grand strategy. NATO does not serve the overall defense of the bloc. It encourages protectorates to influence the domestic and foreign policy of great powers. It results in free riding and strategic chaos. NATO is morphing from a defense alliance into an ideological bureaucracy, needs urgent reversing, and a finite border for the bloc is the primary prerequisite. But I think, as you should say even more, NATO does not secure the peace. On the contrary, NATO is a constant threat to peace. The only wars that there's been on the European continent in the last 30 years have all come about through NATO. There's been no one has been posing any threat to NATO. It's NATO that is the threat to peace. And then, so NATO should immediately forego out of area operations, and the European members of NATO should be guarding European frontiers. And then it says there are two logical ways to offset the China threat. First, the Euro-Atlantic pivot to Asia, with NATO patrolling the Pacific. Second, a relatively self-sufficient Europe and burden shifting so that America, along with its Pacific allies such as Japan and Australia, can focus on balancing the rise of China. The first will not happen. A much more prudent strategy is to force a Europe defended by Europeans with only American naval and as a logistical provider of last resort, with the US reoriented towards Asia. So that's the essay, very well argued.
You didn't see me interjecting very much as I usually do.
Exactly. So then we go back to the Rolling Stone article, and he says, in the second Trump term, we'd almost certainly withdraw from NATO, former National Security Advisor John Bolton predicted recently. The issue has taken on a new urgency as Trump has ratcheted up his antagonism both towards European allies and the Ukrainian government in the wake of Russia's invasion of the country. The former president's continued irritation at NATO allies and his growing agitation against US military aid to Ukraine, which has sought to join the alliance, has ratcheted up fears that Trump would make good on his threats to leave the alliance if he wins the 2024 elections. So that's the Rolling Stone. Now you get these all the Joe Scarboroughs, who regularly have all the David Ignatius and the Richard Haas, who are always regulars on the Joe Scarborough show. This is their absolute panic mode, that NATO is under threat. This is the worst crisis for the West since 1945.
Yeah, but if you ask the average, at least average American, I can't really say about Europeans, but they say, what is NATO? Most have no idea, because this is a institution, ideology. I'm really glad that analyst approached it that way, of the elites. It's only an elite agenda. I mean, my God, we're going to lose NATO. Most people would say, what is that? A postage stamp? What?
Right.
Okay. Is that a payment system?
Right. Yeah.
Isn't it? Okay. I mean, it is such an ingrained elite talking point and idea and moneymaker
Huge
for
amounts of money.
many people there. But for most people, no, don't know what it is. And if I don't know what it is, why should it be important?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. They don't realize that the United States is on the hook then for 30 members of NATO, and they don't realize just how little they all contribute. I mean, they can't even do the 2% of GDP. I mean, after all the talk, when Sergeant Schultz, the Wendung, this is, we made this turning, they still haven't met the 2% of GDP. Because
they've kicked the can down the road, okay? Right. They have a lot of hot air, okay, lots of heat, but no light, as usual, from these people.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's a good deal. I mean, they say, well, great, the Americans are on the hook, and most of the American political establishment, who are also making a lot of money on this, they're absolutely determined. We got to keep this going. Got to strengthen NATO, and so on. And it's in no way is it strengthening European security, and it's not strengthening the United States, because the United States is getting pulled into all sorts of very dangerous conflicts.
It was before the passing of Stephen Cohen. He was on a panel. And he was arguing very much for our line that this is a museum piece that is actually a dangerous organization, not one that keeps peace. And his interlocutor said, "Well, NATO keeps European countries from fighting each other." All right, George, you're in Hungary. Are the Hungarians, if NATO were to lose its luster, is Hungary going into Romania anytime soon?
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
Yes, that's it. And because it's on the contrary, what we learn from history is, how do we get into wars? We get into wars by making all sorts of stupid commitments. It's like you forge these alliances in which you're supposed to then immediately go into war because somebody else getting into a conflict with another power, and suddenly you're on the hook. I mean, it was World War I, World War II. Both started with making a lot of stupid commitments. And that's what NATO is. I mean, it's like, so again, I mean, and NATO says, well, let's make more and more commitments. Well, let's bring NATO, Ukraine in. Let's bring Georgia in. Let's bring Armenia in. You know, just keep making more and more of these commitments.
Or you know, if Russia is the great threat, why don't you sit down and cut a deal with them?
Right. Exactly.
I don't know. I'm out there on, you know, but
Right.
I mean, they need threat inflation.
Yeah.
Threat inflation is always what they need. That's what NATO's secret sauce is.
Yes,
okay.
that's right.
Oh, it could happen, you know. Well, no, why don't you just instead of walking away from arms control agreements, say we need a new generation of arms control agreement, and maybe we won't need this alliance anymore.
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
But you know, it's been mentioned in that research piece, but something George and I have talked about so much. It's just an excuse it's red meat for the electorate in Europe. Is that, you know, we don't have to spend money on defense. We get these clowns in Washington. They'll pay for it all.
Yeah, they're happy to do it. Exactly, they're happy to do it. And then of course Biden then gets himself into a completely unnecessary war, because you kept expanding NATO. I mean, it's like, you know, you know, one should just make it explicit. This war would not have happened without NATO. It was NATO's insistence on something absolutely ridiculous, on something, you know, no American president had ever insisted upon, which is that Ukraine should be part of NATO. It led to catastrophe, and Biden has gone in there. And again, American people will be quite surprised to learn, you know, what is this about? But it is about, you know, that somehow United States wants to insert itself into Ukraine and wants to make Ukraine a dependency of the United States, and that Russia, its neighbor, isn't very happy about it.
I guess it was in foreign policy or foreign affairs. Fiona Hill wrote an article with Stent.
Oh, Angela Stent.
I think
yeah.
that's it.
Yeah, Angela Stent. Yeah.
And it was about, did you know that there was a possible peace agreement in Istanbul a few months ago?
Right.
Of course, George and I talked about it in a nanosecond after it happened, you know, and people that think like George and I talked about it endlessly, and they in a mainstream media, which is basically the you know, the canon for the establishment. Oh well, we have growing evidence, you know. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, exactly. They got a lot of publicity for something that had already been well known for a year. I mean, about that. So, Fiona Hill and Angela Stent, you know, whoa, they're well connected. You know, well, everyone has known about what happened in April 2022. But Fiona Hill is not in a good position to suggest, hey, there could have been a deal, because she was always opposed to any kind of agreements. She kind of wormed her way into the Trump administration. Well, I don't know where she was wormed away. Somehow she got this position of the Trump administration, somebody she hated, and then she recalls how she was at the Helsinki summit between Trump and Putin, and she said she wanted to faint during the news conference because she wanted to sabotage, in other words, create a distraction so that Trump and Putin wouldn't come to any kind of an agreement. You know, so she created distraction by fainting. So horrified was she by the idea that there would be any sort of agreement between the United States and Russia.
And that was a summit like no other in American history, where the press corps went there to sabotage their own president, a president who was elected by the American people, and to the person. They went there to sabotage it, and they did. They succeeded.
They did. That's right. Exactly. That's exactly what they did. Exactly. They went in there and to try to destroy it. And I think that's when Putin said, I think after that news conference, something like that was a shit show or something like that, which it was. But that was exactly.
Well, you know, it's one of these things that it's really hard to it's hard to confront, because the people that are NATO lovers, okay, we'll use term
exactly. Yes.
They do it reflexively. NATO not only no longer has any viable, meaningful role, it is a destructive organization, and it's creating instability, and they want to continue down this path here. What is the potential for NATO membership done for Ukraine?
Yeah.
It's destroyed the country. Okay,
Exactly.
I mean, it doesn't work. Get rid of it. Okay, and you know, and have a new security agreement. Okay, maybe just a European one. And then when you have to start coughing up paying for it, you're going to say, well, we don't really think it's that big of a risk. Okay, then it's just totally different. And also remember, since the end of the Cold War, even actually during it, but particularly since the end of the Cold War, European arms manufacturing, with a few specific niche areas, has collapsed. So where do they get all the weapons from? From the United States.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what little they do pay, they're paying American arms manufacturers. You know, the French still have some planes, and the Germans have some tanks that aren't working out too well in Ukraine. You know, and then the British will have some, like, you know, missiles. Okay, but it is the largest trading bloc in the world per capita. It is the richest part of the globe. Okay, and you can't get this stuff done.
Yeah. No,
you know, I mean, that's a European problem. Okay, it's not an American problem.
Exactly. And it's very interesting that if you create a military alliance that is directed at Russia, well, what do you expect is going to happen? Relations between Europe and Russia are going to steadily deteriorate. There's going to be growing hostility among states towards Russia. It was obviously it was going to happen. Remember, you know, back in the 90s, when Russia was already expressing concerns about NATO expansion, and the Americans said, no, it's going to create stability. You're going to have better relations with Poland, the Baltic states, because of NATO. There's going to be better relations. But of course, it was obvious, and, you know, the Russians weren't, you know, they weren't buying it. But of course, if you create an anti-Russian alliance, then yeah, it's just going to keep stirring up intense anti-Russian fervor. And this has been going on. This is long predated Ukraine. It predated Maidan. I mean, the hostility towards Russia it's been getting worse and worse and worse year in, year out. Again, you know, it was even in the Obama years that it was getting worse and worse and worse. And that's the effect of it. And so, but going back to your point about the Americans, I mean, the Americans have their own problems, and that's, you know, Trump's, you know, what is an anathema about Trump is that he says, well, these are our problems, you know, boom, boom. Well, like the problem with the border, our declining industrial capability, you know, the drug problems, our mounting debt. One of the problems is not NATO. It's not Ukraine. Ukraine isn't among the list. So if I'm going to list the 4 or 5 problems that a U.S. president needs to address, then Ukraine isn't really among them. But of course, that's horrific. You know, the Joe Scarborough and Richard Hart. Well, Ukraine and Israel are the 2 main problems for the United States. Nothing else. Ukraine and Israel.
Yeah, I'm sure homeless people in Los Angeles feel that way, George.
Right. Exactly. So
we got to give more money to Ukraine. Sure.
And I think this has always been the nightmare for the U.S. political establishment, that there will be a populist will emerge who's going to ask that question. You know, well, how is this a priority for us? I mean, how is this a problem for the American people? No one can do that, and most of the time this works. I mean, most of the politicians are like Nikki Haley and Mike Pence and you know, the fat boy from New Jersey, Chris Christie. You know, that's it. What's the main problem? Ukraine. What's the second problem? Israel, or maybe vice versa. But that's most American politicians are like that.
I just want to comment real quickly on something you said about a minute and a half ago. The way it was pitched to the Russians, the NATO expansion, is that it would decrease tensions, okay, because they'll be in a block, so they'll feel protected and they won't feel threatened by you. But what happened? And George and I know Eastern European history really well. Once you're in the club and you close the door, well, Washington's our friend now, okay? Now we can say whatever we want because we have an umbrella. See, the exact opposite happened.
Exactly, yeah.
And anyone that knows the history of this part of the world would know it would happen. Then you have the Baltic republics, they're rabid little chihuahuas. Then you have Poland, they're a hyena. You actually enabled the very worst parts of their national identity. Okay, you encourage the worst parts.
That's right. That's exactly it. You know, and have generated hostility that were in states that weren't even that hostile during the communist era. Even when they didn't particularly like communism, you've got to generate like in Romania, or in the Czech Republic, Bulgaria. They would actually had pretty reasonable relations even during the Cold War. You've kind of whipped up essentially this anti-Russian fervor as your membership dues. You're in this club, and as part of your membership dues to show you that you are a loyal member of the club, that you are, you support the chairman of the board, you have to show we're going to kick out some Russian diplomats. We're going to kick out 6 Russian diplomats tomorrow.
One of the most remarkable things in modern international relations, and very few people have reflected about it, George and I have, is that the Soviet Union on its own collapsed a major military bloc without a proverbial fire shot. Right. It's really extraordinary. It's truly extraordinary. It was one of the most opportune moments in modern international relations to say, look, we were in a standoff for 40 years. One is standing down. We'll stand down too. Let's figure something out. That was a huge missed opportunity. And George F. Kennan and many other people like that said, yeah, this is the time. Okay. Stephen Cohen also would be saying something like that.
Right, that's right. So by going back to Trump, the question is still, okay, this guy, he may have a position in the Trump administration. How far can Trump get with this program? Assuming he's not going to hire, all right, he's going to avoid hiring Pompeo and Bolton, Nikki Haley, Jim Mattis, and
okay, George,
Rex Tillerson, and he's not going to hire any of those. How far can he get with this program?
I'm going to say something very provocative right now. If Trump returns to the Oval Office, which is a huge, big question. There's so many hurdles. Okay, so many. Democracy isn't one of those hurdles, though. Right. But anyway, there's a lot of other issues out there. My provocative statement is that if he does, and he's intent on modifying, at the very least, America's role in NATO, I hope he can trust the Secret Service.
I think so, because he's going to have the apparat up against him, because they already mobilized against him in 2015, 2016, particularly the British, because they read that book he wrote in 1999 about how America should pull out of NATO. They were already taking all of that very seriously. This is a guy who needs to be stopped. And it wasn't because he said, Mexico is not sending its best. They didn't care that much about that. But the fact he was calling into question this ridiculous system, which should be called into question, but no one dares to do it, then that's why he has to be stopped. So,
and the British were doubly panicking because they had Brexit. Okay. Yeah. And so NATO is their segue into Europe. Okay. Yeah. So that's what made them doubly concerned about Trump. And of course, Trump was supposed to release all the intelligence, the British, but no, didn't happen.
No.
Declassify it.
Okay. That's exactly it. Because of the British,
and then he gets in trouble having declassified documents.
Yes. Well, that was always the case. I mean, that was Trump had to have known. I mean, that he had powerful forces. They were determined to destroy him. So you always have to look out for that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the British, the secret to post-war British success, how it's been able to punch above its weight, has been the American connection. And the American connection comes through NATO. So if somebody calls NATO into question, then Britain has lost the American connections, and then it's not going to be able to keep punching above its weight.
Well, because they certainly don't have the fleets that they used to have. They don't have the military and industrial capacity that they used to.
Right.
They've just financialized their economy too. So the only thing they have left is this arcane organization called NATO.
Yeah.
When NATO, I'm being optimistic here, when NATO is finally dissolved out of humiliation and defeat, the United Kingdom will definitively and forever be moving forward, not the United Kingdom, but little England.
Yeah, that's true.
All righty.
Yeah.
This is our usual rant against NATO. I enjoyed it. I feel good.
Yeah, always enjoy it. Yeah, you can't get enough of that. And however much we rant, it's never enough.
Never enough.
Whatever we say about NATO, it's never enough.
Nectar from the gods. Exactly. All right, everybody. This is The Gaggle with Peter and George. We're on Local, so please go to thegaggle.locals.com. This is Wednesday, right, buddy? What's happening tomorrow? Tell your pop. Jump up here. What? Tell me. George's live stream tomorrow.
Live stream, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Buddy's absolutely right. Come with comments, criticism, suggestions, and think about little Buddy, because Buddy says, I wanted to quit NATO, like yesterday. So, it's a bit, bit bloody late for people coming a bit now to the party. So because Buddy feels so indignant, we need to, put him into a better mood. He's always in a foul mood. So if you've got a few bob in your pocket, whip them out, dunk them in his tip jar. Might alleviate his mood. I don't know. So we're very grateful for all of your help and friendship and support. The more you're able to donate, the more of these videos we can make, the more we can improve the technology. And above all, Buddy will feel that, hey, I wish people weren't stealing my ideas all the time. So remember, if you like The Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.